welcome to another episode of Rustacean Station. I'm your host, Alan Wyma, and today I'm with Roel. Now, Roel is a software engineer in the Netherlands. He recently created a library in Rust all about how to work with ID3, which is like a metadata library for, ID3 is like a metadata within some certain types of files. I was understanding that they're actually only in MP3, but apparently then other things too. I think WAV files also may have ID3. Anyways, I'll let you go ahead and talk about that, but why don't you first introduce yourself?
Yeah, okay. So my legal name is Roel, though most people know me on the internet as Polyfloyd, which is my Twitter handle and also my GitHub handle. And also my internet domain, polyfloyd.net, on which I have a few blogs, of which also some Rust related. I'm not the original creator of this package. It has been created way, way before I even started learning Rust, I believe. I've been programming in Rust since 2016, 2017, something like that. And around this time, I also started out in a project in which I wanted to have like a kind of MPD kind of daemon that automatically mixes music. So retempos it, mixes it, crossfades it. I never really got around to finishing it because it's like software, it's hard. But it did yield me the ID3 package, which I obviously had to use to be able to read the metadata from my audio files. When using it, I noticed that the API could be better. It didn't really make use of all the powerful features that Rust had. So for example, to create a new frame, I will be going over the file spec in a bit. To create a frame, you would have to instantiate the frame, make it mutable to be able to set a content and set the content and add it to a tag. But it's good to avoid mud in Rust. So I submitted a pull request to not have to do that.
You mentioned quite a lot, and I'm trying to follow. So maybe we can kind of talk a little bit more. What is exactly ID3, right? What kind of things are we expecting in ID3?
Yeah, so ID3 is a metadata format specifically intended to be used in audio files. The initial ID3 V2 specification dates from 1999. There's also ID3 V1 before that, but it is nothing like the V2, and I am not sure when this was introduced.
What I thought was kind of interesting too is that when I looked at Wikipedia, and ID3 is there's multiple versions, right?
Yeah.
I think there's actually no standardization committee or something. It's a little bit confusing about how this actually gets standardized then.
Well, the standards which I follow to be able to maintain this library consists of 3 documents which state themselves as informal standards. And also state there's going to be a formal standard later. But this is the best there is. And it's also quite surprising that a standard has this many gaps in the information that it should provide is used in so many applications.
Yeah, but what kinds of data are actually stored in there? I know there's track name, I think, are in there, the artist name, the album name, anything else?
Oh, yeah, it is those things that you see on your screen when you play a file. So artist, album artist, that is a distinct field. Track index in the album, year of release, the name of the publisher, like a cool image that you can show, album art, for example. There's also quite some more obscure kind of metadata frames can be added. So, for example, MPEG, if you have a variable bitrate MPEG, you have the progression of time is not going to be linear to the stream of the file. So you can add an index to your ID3 tag, and players can use that to be able to look up the right offsets in the file to seek to a specific time offset at some point.
That's basically like chapters, right? Because I heard that you can add chapters to your podcast.
Oh boy, chapters are something completely different.
Oh, really? I thought that would be what it is because you said offsets, right? That's what I'm thinking about.
No, I was just referring to MLLD tags, MPEG location lookup tables. These just concern the audio data. Within that audio data, you can, of course, specify, at this offset or this timestamp starts some chapter, past the intro, prologue, epilogue, stuff like that. That's just names. You can encode that in chapter frames, but also in synchronized lyrics. These are 2 distinct data frames in the tag.
Maybe can we actually define what is a frame? Because frames have so many meanings in computer science, right? Because you use this word quite a lot.
So the ID3 tag consists of a header that it specifies the version, it specifies a few encoding flags, and it specifies the size. And after that come 0 or more frames. And each frame in an ID3 tag has an identifier specifying what kind of frame it is. So TALP is an album frame containing just a string of text specifying the album. ID2 is the album artist, if I recall correctly. And yeah, multiple frames make up the information inside a tag.
Okay, so if I open up MP3, like I'm going to have different kinds of data. I'm just trying to think about what would actually be like the structure of this thing. It sounds very complicated because, you'd figure it's just audio, but we have a bunch of metadata, right?
Yeah.
Is this all at the beginning of the file, or like how can I think about the structure?
This whole tag is completely distinct from MP3. It has nothing to do with MP3, or MPEG does not know anything about ID3. So it is just a piece of data that is appended to the audio.
Okay, so then like VLC or these kinds of players can actually see that stuff as soon as it opens up the file, and it kind of like keeps it in memory.
Oh yeah, they can
sync everything up. Okay, That's basically how it usually works, right?
Although usually ID3 is a bit of an odd one in like the way you encode metadata in multimedia files. Usually, the metadata comes after the video or the audio stream. This is because its metadata often contains information about the stream itself. And if you are writing a stream, you will not have this information as a whole yet. So you have to wait until everything is written. And after you've written the entire file, you can actually like know what kind of metadata you want to write. But ID3 is different because it comes before the actual content.
But that must make it pretty easy for parsing this kind of stuff, right? Because with the library, you just start reading at the very beginning, like byte 0, right?
Yes. If a file starts with like ASCII ID3, you can be pretty sure that there is an ID3 tag in there. You can read the size of the tag from the header and then skip past it to get to the actual audio.
Yeah, again, kind of like when you read this informal spec, like who's actually publishing this informal spec? Because I didn't see any names for ID3.
No, neither did I. But that's also not really the part that I'm interested in when writing a library like this. I just want to have this information and I don't really care who wrote it.
Well, what I worry about is like, thinking about CSS, right? Where you have all these kind of browser prefixes and certain browsers support certain things and some others don't. Like, that's what I'm starting to think about. Like, how standard is this enough? Like, things can be read. Like, what are you actually supporting when you're supporting this thing and how do you follow it?
There is the spec, of course, but there's also the actual real world use. There are a lot of audio files out there, and if I am able to just read 99% of them, I can be pretty sure that I have followed the whatever specification these files used to encode their metadata. This is also part of the test suite, and also why the actual ID3 library is incomplete. I only have support built for the actual frames that people use, because the encoding of these frames can like differ or it's not well defined. So when someone asks me like, oh yeah, hey, I want to decode this audio file, can you add support? I really need to have a sample to be able to know whether I did it correctly.
It's a little bit kind of scary because couldn't some files have different ways of doing the same thing?
Oh yeah, for sure. Cannot really recall any whether this has happened in the past, although I do believe that at some point I had a bug. This was like 3 years ago. ID3 was encoding files, but it had 1 byte too much, if I recall correctly. Or there was an off by 1 somewhere. And a lot of tools just happily accepted the metadata that was being produced, except for FFmpeg. When someone pointed this out, yeah, of course I had to fix it. But yeah, this also serves as an example of how broadly accepting most decoders are of this format.
Now, using FFmpeg is like a kind of like a test to see like, okay, how does it read this file? How does it read that file? And I should be doing about the same.
Yeah. As of when this bug was fixed, FFmpeg also became a part of the test suite. So FFmpeg will always be able to decode the files that this library is generating.
Okay. May I ask, like, what kind of got you interested in this ID3 library? Because I'm kind of a little bit of a fanatic. I like to listen to Spotify nearly all the time. And I mean, like, why ID3? Like, why is this something that you thought was so interesting that you were willing to take over this project?
Well, my whole music library of like 300 gigabytes back in 2017 was all MP3, which used this format. I considered also like writing my own decoder, and I'm very happy I did not do that because of all the complexities I was not aware of back then. But also because this package is published on crates.io as ID3. And I think that when you search as a programmer, search on crates, the crate that matches your exact search query should be able to fulfill your use case. So a package called ID3 should be like the best solution for decoding ID3 that is out there.
Okay. So when you were looking at this for Rust, right? Like, What were you planning to do with this? I understand you have a lot of MP3s, but like, what were you planning to use Rust with your MP3s in the ID3?
Well, as I said this earlier, I wanted to create kind of MPD placement that could also automatically mix between audio files. And ID3 was just a small part of that application.
Are you still working on this application, or has it been parked for the time being?
It has been parked for the time being. One of the things that made me lose interest was not being able to handle all different sample formats. And the main thing that could solve that was, sorry, I cannot recall what this feature was called. It has landed in Rust a few versions ago, so I might be able to fire up my interest for this project again.
I'm kind of curious, what are other people using this library for? Similar things, or like stuff that you, I mean, is there people come up to you with questions and their product is just really out there?
Oh, yeah. So the most notable project that I am aware of that uses ID3 is a project called Polaris. And Polaris is, I've not used it myself yet, but it seems to be a kind of self-hosted Spotify. So you install it on a server, you give it access to some files in a directory, and when you visit the web server that it runs, you can play those files from your web browser.
Oh, that's pretty cool. I didn't know that's written in Rust. I think I've heard the name before.
Oh, yeah. I've also applied ID3 in one project that I did in 2018, which was a Fuse driver that used SoundCloud as a backend. That was a very interesting project to write, actually, because SoundCloud does not prepend these ID3 tags to their files. So an ID3 tag is generated from the SoundCloud API on the fly, then served to whatever application is opening the file.
Okay, I see. So I think the biggest news and one of the strangest things that's happening is that for some reason, I don't know why, you had this crazy idea to suddenly say 1.0 for your ID3 version. What was the change that made you say, okay, this is finally 1.0 compared to everybody else who even, I think Tokyo just came 1.0 a couple of years ago, sorry. But a lot of bigger libraries are all like pre-1, right? So what was the change and why you decided to do 1.0?
Well, there's two aspects to that. One is that marking your crate 1.0 gives off a certain guarantee about its quality and stability. And I thought that ID3 would really be better if I could give off these guarantees. And also to be able to make the API more predictable and make maintenance easier. Because maintenance of this library is something that is always lingering in my head somewhere in a corner. And whenever someone comes along and says, oh yeah, can we add this frame? I can, of course, but it would break the API. And I needed to implement a solution that would provide forward compatibility for anything that is yet to come. This 1.0 release has this. It has it solved.
So then you already have guaranteed API then. You're saying this is the way it's going to be and you're pretty happy with that.
Yes, I am mostly happy. There's a few things that could, of course, be better. But as for people upgrading from lower versions to 1.0, I also did not want to confront them with too much breakage. Like, you should be able to implement this change in any project that's already using it.
So is there a lot of breaking change or it's pretty similar?
The breaks are guaranteed, but they are not as severe. There are two things that really need someone to step in and like fix it if you're upgrading. That all the functions which you set, like artists or retrieve artists, the kind of alias functions for these frame numbers or frame IDs have been moved to a separate trait because it has been implemented for chapter frames as well. You can also use these functions on chapter frames, which have also been added in 1.0. And this requires you to import the trait into the scope. Another breaking change is that the functions for reading and writing tags have been renamed. Most of them have been renamed, some have stayed the same. But this was to make it more obvious on the state what kind of data types these functions operate on.
Is this library strictly a synchronous library? Because I didn't see any like backend, like async runtime, sorry.
No, this is all synchronous. You can, of course, asynchronously read the tag into a buffer and then have the ID3 just parse it.
Yeah, and I also see, which is quite nice, is that you have very, very few dependencies in here. But I definitely have never heard of some of these, right? So you have bit flags, byte order, and flate2. So what are these libraries actually for?
So bitflags is internally used to handle the frame and the tag headers quite nicely. I could rule that myself, but bitflag is a quite trivial library as well. It is also 1.0 stable, so there's no harm in using it as far as I am aware.
As I say, actually, everything that you just have it set to version 1, which when I first looked at it, I was like, are these flags, future flags? But you just put 1 instead of like 1 dot something.
Yeah.
So this is quite interesting.
Well, it is similar to just having a caret dependency. Rust's cargo will be able to find a suitable version if you have like a more constrained spec in another package or your own cargo toml file.
Yeah, I was also thinking like everything in here is version 1, so maybe that also was why you want to go 1 to kind of match with these.
No, not necessarily. Although I am very happy that I only have 1.0 tier dependencies.
Okay, but yeah, you're saying bit flags makes life easier when you're parsing. How about byte order and Flate 2?
Flate 2 is to handle the compression that can be optionally applied in ID3 tags. I'm just not going to roll that myself, and there's also no point in doing so because Flate 2 is perfectly stable as it is. Byte order is a bit of a relic as far as it is used in this library. It still has some pretty interesting use cases, but now that Rust has added endianness encoding functions to the standard library, it's not really used anymore. But it also doesn't really pull in any dependencies by itself, so I've just not seen any point in removing it.
But you also do have a dev dependency of temp file, right? And it looks like that's just for creating temporary files. I suppose that's just for your tests.
Yeah, that is just for running the unit tests. There are some tests bundled, or test files bundled with this library, and all the files get copied to a temporary directory when you run the test suite.
But why do you have to bring a separate library for that? I mean, isn't that usually something like /tmp, or you want to just kind of have this able to be worked on for any OS?
Well, just as the other dependencies that I pull in, temp file is a fairly stable library. And yeah, just being able to offload the creation and location of temp files to this library is also fairly useful, especially because temp files also need to be cleaned up after the test suite runs.
Okay, and so that all hooks into the test suite. Okay, I never played with temp file before. Actually, the first time I ever heard of it, but it made sense as soon as I read it. So this ID3 it's just one single dependency, right? It's not actual workspace with many different libraries. Everything's kind of small enough you can fit to one single crate.
Yes, this library is small enough to just keep to one crate. I also don't think having workspaces for this library would add anything, because honestly, workspaces are a bit more complicated to handle than just a single library.
And you've already upgraded to 2021 edition, which is interesting. I see a lot of people still running on 2018. What made you decide to upgrade?
It was more of a desire to be on the latest version. I'm not sure whether it is going to prevent me from doing more convenient things in the future. Yeah, it seemed useful to upgrade with the 1.0 release.
How come James Hurst decided that he didn't want to work on this anymore? Do you have any idea?
No, I don't think he told me any reason on why he did not want to work on it anymore. But yeah, I imagine it is something like getting on in life and doing something else with your time.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Because open source maintenance it does take effort.
Speaking of that, how has your experience been with this library? Because you always hear the horror stories, but I don't know, is your life been pretty okay, or you ever have some very not so pleasant people you have to deal with?
Oh no, I cannot relate to any horror stories whatsoever. I do get requests. I also get pull requests, which I am very happy. I'm very happy that other people fixed problems that I am tasked with from other people. But no, contributors to this project are generally quite kind, very happy.
That's good. You're not working on this by yourself. There's sometimes you have a project that's quite popular, but you're the only one who works on it, which is it depends on your feeling and everything, but
yeah.
You're pretty happy with this.
I do have to say, I do not fix everything myself immediately, and this is fairly major flaw. If someone wants support for a new frame, if they want it quickly, the best way to do that is to write an implementation by themselves. Because if I will be doing it, it will be months from when they first report it.
Okay, so if somebody writes it, but maybe not so well, or has some problems with it, then you'll probably kind of come and help out and maybe take over.
Oh yeah.
I see. But I did see on here, sadly, you're not 1.00 anymore. What happened?
Oh yeah. So Maricon 5, if I recall correctly, submitted a pull request just after 1.0 released, stating that there was a problem with, I think it was synchronized lyrics. Synchronized lyrics turned out to also have a kind of description field that was not present in the structure that encodes this frame. So I quickly reviewed it and released it. This also is kind of, strictly speaking, a breaking change because it adds a field to a public struct. So I yanked the initial 1.0 release, seeing as it was less than a day old. Can happen, but I'm happy it happened right at the time it did.
And I asked you about the future roadmap of ID3, right? And you're saying you're maybe thinking about making a C API. Like, what would be the reason for that? Because you think that this is a library that C people might want to use?
Well, it is something that I need for myself. I am using this library in a new project. It's like a private thing that I'm working on. But this project is written in Go, and to be able to interoperate with Go, it needs to have some kind of foreign function interface. And yeah, well, that's a C API. I'm not sure whether I will ever release it or whether it is going to be as unstable as it is right now. But if there's any demand for it, then, well, yeah, maybe I will. Also, a very interesting thought that crossed my mind is if it gains a C API, then the use cases will become even broader. And that means that this library is going to affect the audio files that will be out there in the wild. So if it gets popular enough, it could become its own standard, but that is a very far fantasy.
It's a very big dream. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's something that it could happen, right? Like, we had a guest on the show, the guy who created Hyper.
Oh, yeah.
So he came on the show and he was like, oh, yeah, somebody told me that. Like, I think he said NASA's using his library or something like that. Somebody just kind of told him, oh, yeah, this is here. Also, the Nest, I think, is using it too. So he was just like, wow, a little bit humbling almost, a little bit shocking.
Yeah, that's cool. Although I do hope that if NASA is going to encode the audio, they will use some more modern format that has an easier spec to work with.
Yeah, I don't know. I always hear that NASA's using, big tapes still. But I also heard that the big tapes are much more reliable than modern hard drives, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you wanted to state about the ID3 library before we kind of wrap up with some other questions about yourself?
Well, yeah, I want to say something about the forward compatibility that I had to build. I thought that was a fairly interesting problem that I need to solve. And it has to do with what happens to the API when you add a frame. So a frame in the ID3 library is a struct that has an ID field. It has some other things that also appear in frame header. It has a content, and the content in this library is an enum, a Rust enum, with variants for all the different kind of frame types that can appear. So pictures is a variant, synchronized lyrics is a variant, lyrics is a variant, comment is a variant, etc. So when someone comes to me and asks me, hey, can you add support for whatever, this enum needs to change. And this in turn is a breaking change because an exhaustive match on this enum is going to not work anymore and needs the new case to be added. You can fix that in Rust, and you can force a match to be non-exhaustive by adding kind of default match branch that is going to be used. And when you add a variant to this enum, this content enum, it is not going to break anymore. But this still is going to result in breakage, because the library is able to decode frames that it does not know about, and this will become an unknown frame, or unknown frame content. And a valid use case for this library is to have your own decoder for this frame in its binary form. But adding upstream support means that frames that previously decoded to an unknown content type are going to decode to some other type, meaning that any match that relies on it being unknown is going to do something different. Suddenly, you will not get a compiler error, which is very bad. So what I did is add a new function that is called toUnknown, and it returns a cow, a copy on write object, to this unknown content. If you're running an older version of the library, you are going to have the actual unknown content object in your cow as a borrowed variant. But if you have upgraded and support has been added in the meantime, you are going to get an ad hoc encoding of whatever content it is that you wanted to access. And this is, of course, going to be decoded by your implementation as well, which is not super efficient, but it is going to result in the same behavior, which is important.
Okay, so we can start to have our own kind of content types, our own type of frames.
Yeah.
Okay, that's pretty cool. Anything else?
Oh, yeah. I wrote a rant on the Reddit thread about why ID3 is such a peculiar format. You may want to check it out if you want to have a laugh. Have a laugh at my struggles.
If you have the link, we can definitely put it into the show notes so people can check it out.
Oh, yeah. I'll send it over.
Other than that, let's talk a little bit more about Netherlands, right? Because I think I hear a lot about Rust in Germany, Rust in Sweden. I haven't heard a lot of Rust in Netherlands, though. What's the Rust community like in Netherlands?
Well, there is definitely a Rust community, although it is fairly small. It has also been particularly hard hit by the pandemic because it consisted, as far as I'm aware, of regular meetups in the city of Utrecht. I visited a few of those. I also invited this meetup over to my hackerspace at one point. But they're cool people.
What are actually people using Rust for in Netherlands?
Cannot really think of anything right now. Although I am in a bit of a different space as far as programming is concerned. Professionally, I work with Go, the Go programming language. I have one colleague right now that is also very fond of Rust, but other than that, it is not used within the company.
This is a good question. Like, what do you think about between Go and Rust? Like, what is your feelings?
I prefer one or the other depending on the use case. Go is used within my field of work for highly networked, high I/O services. I tried to do that with Rust, although this was years ago, so my experience may not reflect the current future or the current situation. But if you're doing something like that, then, well, I would go with Go. But with Rust, what I noticed is that I am writing less unit tests when writing Rust. And that is not because writing tests in Rust is hard. In fact, it's pretty easy. But it's just that I don't really feel like it is necessary in a degree that is also necessary in other languages, because the language itself also enforces the correctness. And if you know how to use it like that, you can be pretty sure that your program does what you intended to do when you just compile it. That is very powerful of Rust.
Yeah, not to mention, I mean, I think like the refactoring is also quite interesting too. Like, but I guess should be similar with Go too. When you have a typed language, when you refactor, the types makes it much easier to refactor, and now things should be pretty much okay.
Yes, that is very true. Although Go is lacking like properly strict typed subtypes or enums.
Yeah, and I heard they recently got generics in.
Almost. That release, Go 1.18, is due to go live next month, I'm sure, if I recall correctly.
How about, have you ever gotten seg faults before while writing Go?
Yeah, I have, but that was because I was working with FFI.
Oh, okay. So it's more of a C issue then.
Yeah, definitely.
How about the garbage collector? Has that been any problem for you? Because I see that a lot about people kind of complaining about garbage collection in Go.
No, I don't think so. The garbage collector has gotten faster over the years, but I've never really run into any issues with it.
I recently saw an article written by the Uber team, I think, and they had a whole very long article about how to tune the garbage collector, which I thought, if you're using Rust, you'd never have this issue. No. I feel like such a waste.
No, you definitely don't have that in Rust. What you do have in Rust is making sure, or like spending some extra care on adding generics in places where the Rust compiler can actually optimize for inlining and static calls as opposed to like dynamic dispatch. Go, everything is dynamic dispatch. And I stated that I don't really have had any issues with garbage collection or memory management in Go, but I also have a creeping feeling that it is not as efficient as a computer program can be.
You mean when you're running Go code, you feel it's not very efficient?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I've definitely ran into this issue in the past. I had a function that was decoding an image or encoding an image to some RGB format, and the image interface of Go only consists of a function to access a single pixel. And when you run that in a nested loop, it is going to do a dynamic dispatch for every loop permutation.
Is there anything that you think Go does right that Rust doesn't?
Yes, the asynchronous part has been fairly well integrated into the language. All Go code runs asynchronous by default. There's an event loop inside every binary that is being compiled.
Oh, you mean the Go routines, right?
Yeah, Go routines. Furthermore, as of Go, I'm not even going to bother remembering the function or the version anymore. We also have contexts. Contexts can be used to cancel functions which are presumed to be long-running, to also save resources if you don't really need the result anymore. And also to pass additional information into functions, or even external services can pass information from this context along, which makes for very interesting solutions regarding debugging and tracing and generally flame graphs and such.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. So besides like working with Rust, working with Go, how are you keeping busy? Because I think you're actually going to be participating in an upcoming event, right?
Oh, yeah. So every 4 years in the Netherlands, we organize a big hacker event. It is every 4 years. It is known by a different name. But if you are familiar with the terms SHA 2017, OHM 2013, then you may want to check out MCH 2022. The abbreviation stands for May Contain Hackers. We will be visiting Zeewolde, a lush green scouting terrain in the polder, surrounded by dikes. We'll have lectures, workshops on the subjects of technology, information security, society, and science. It's great. I went there last time. I also took part in the organization, which was great as well. I'm also helping out in the organization of this event as well. So yeah, check out MCH 2022 if you're in the area coming summer.
Is that going to be in English or is that going to be in Dutch?
It is mostly English as for lectures and workshops and stuff. We have a lot of visitors coming from all kinds of countries, mostly Germany, United Kingdom, Denmark, Belgium, France, United States even. It's a fairly big event. We aim to have at least 3,500 attendees, up to 5,000.
Even with this current situation with the pandemic?
Yes. We expect to have some degree of countermeasures active during the event. I don't have a glass orb that I can, or a crystal ball that I can ponder to predict the future. But as the current situation is unfolding, I think we will have an event. And we will also have a great event. It's going to be great seeing everyone again.
That's fantastic. Maybe someday I have to make it out there, but maybe not this year. The main reason is that I don't want to be in a hotel for 21 days.
Mm-hmm.
So over here we have 21-day quarantine.
Mm-hmm. That's when you come back, right?
Yeah, but I'm sure there must be a quarantine when I arrive there. So I have to arrive 2 months early or something like that.
Yeah.
Which is the horrible part.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Is there anything else you wanted to mention before we sign off?
Well, as for MCH, also check out whether you have a hackerspace in the area, because that is how I became involved in programming languages that are not really used in business, and also meet some new people.
Yeah. I know we have a hackerspace or 2 to 3 hackerspaces over here, but I haven't checked them out. I don't exactly know what a hackerspace is. It seems like more like on the hardware side.
Yeah, well, hardware is the thing that is most notable, of course. Hardware takes up actual space in a physical room, and software does not. Its software just stays in your computer. But there are some software people in hackerspaces.
So what actually is a hackerspace if you would define it to people?
I would define a hackerspace as a physical space where people that push the boundaries of technology, security as well, to what can be achieved. Also pushing your own boundaries. That's important.
Yeah, I mean, if there's nothing else, then I think, it's great to have you on. Happy to finally meet somebody who has 1.0 library out there, because I haven't met too many people. Too many of the smaller fish, right? Besides Tokyo.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, again, thanks for coming on, and I appreciate it. I hope that ID3 keeps going strong and more people use it.
Yeah, thank you for having me over.